He sat on the edge of his bed, shoulders slouched, staring at the glow of his phone. The screen lit up the room with a pale, artificial light. Outside, the city was quiet. Inside, he felt a low, persistent weight he couldn't name. His eyes flicked over the feed, scanning updates, notifications, videos he had no memory of wanting to watch. The clock read 2:47 a.m. Another night spent scrolling. Another night of quiet unease. He wasn't anxious in the sharp, panicked sense. There was no racing heart, no shouting alarms, just a dull, insistent sense that something was off, that something he couldn't quite identify was slipping away from him. In his 20s, he had learned to live in this low hum of discomfort. He told himself he was just relaxing or taking a break. He had excuses ready. A little downtime didn't hurt. A few episodes, a few minutes online. But over the months, those minutes became hours. Hours that quietly vanished into nothing. He remembered a Sunday evening not long ago. He had intended to work on a side project, a small idea he thought might matter someday. But as soon as he opened his laptop, a message popped up. Then another. Then an alert from a social media app. By the time he realized, he had spent the entire afternoon responding, scrolling, and refreshing. Nothing productive had been done, nothing tangible to show for the time. And yet he didn't feel dramatic guilt. Not yet, just a subtle, nagging dissatisfaction, the kind that made him glance at his calendar and wince. Empty spaces meant to hold progress, empty reminders of commitments he had made to himself and quietly ignored. He noticed the irony in it. He wanted more. He wanted to feel accomplished. He wanted to see results. But he had unknowingly built a rhythm of avoidance that made those goals unreachable. The habit wasn't dramatic. It wasn't reckless or wild. It was small, consistent, and deceptively harmless. He had convinced himself that comfort was equivalent to rest, that distraction was a reward for being busy, that scrolling a feed counted as time off. Then there were the moments that cut a little deeper, casual conversations with friends, seeing someone post about finishing a project, traveling, learning something new. Not a full life he had to envy, just glimpses of time used differently, a pinch of something he had been trying to ignore. Envy? Regret? Or maybe just recognition of his own quiet drift. He had days when he tried to connect the dots, to analyze what was happening. He saw the patterns. Days filled with partially completed tasks, promises to himself made and broken, ambitions that existed only in drafts on his computer, sticky notes on his desk or in his head. And still he returned to the same habits without thinking. It wasn't dramatic failure. There were no missed flights, no public embarrassment, just small, repeated choices that over time created a sense of being behind, time he could never get back, tasks that never reached completion, opportunities he had let slip, and the weight of it settled on him quietly, like dust accumulating in the corner of a room. That night, sitting on his bed, he felt the pressure more clearly than usual. Not a rush of panic, but the soft insistence of reality pressing in. A thought that had been in the back of his mind for months nudged forward. The life he imagined for himself in the mornings, productive, creative, purposeful, was not aligning with the life he lived in these late hours. The discomfort was subtle, the kind that could easily be ignored if he wanted to. He could dismiss it as temporary, as normal for his age. He could sleep a few hours, wake up, and continue in the same pattern. Most nights, that's what he did. Most nights, he pretended the clock and the glowing screen didn't matter. But tonight, it was harder to ignore. The weight of wasted time pressed not in loud alarms or crises, but in quiet reflection. And in that quiet, he realized something he hadn't admitted to himself before. It wasn't just about being behind. It was about living small, about letting the days slip through his fingers without intention, without attention, without care. And for a moment, sitting there in the dim light, he felt the truth. He had been failing himself, not in dramatic ways, but in subtle, cumulative ones. not through one mistake, but through hundreds of small, seemingly harmless decisions, each one insignificant on its own, but together forming a pattern that defined his 20s more than any goal or achievement. He put the phone down finally. Just for a moment, the room was quiet again. Outside, the city slept. He felt restless. He didn't feel inspired. He didn't feel ready to change. But he felt aware. That awareness was uncomfortable, almost painful. And yet, in its quiet way, it was the first crack in the habits that had been quietly, invisibly shaping his life. He began to notice it slowly, almost too late. The habit that was quietly shaping his days wasn't dramatic. It wasn't skipping work, drinking too much, or any sudden failure. It was quieter, more mundane, and yet, over time, it had become a force that controlled more of his life than he realized. It was the habit of distraction, not in bursts of chaos, but in small, repeated moments that seemed harmless in isolation. Opening the phone without purpose, checking messages as a reflex, refreshing feeds while waiting for the coffee to brew or the elevator to arrive. It didn't feel like stealing time. It didn't feel wrong. It was just there, a soft, unthinking action he repeated hundreds of times a day. He had convinced himself it was normal. Everyone did it, didn't they? A quick scroll to relax, a few minutes to zone out, a harmless pause in an otherwise busy life. But it wasn't harmless. The minutes added up. They stretched into hours. He didn't try to overhaul his life all at once. He knew from experience that would only lead to frustration. Instead, he picked one small thing, something almost too small to matter. He left his phone in another room while making coffee in the morning. Just 5 minutes. No scrolling, no notifications, no reflexive check-ins. He told himself it was nothing, but it felt significant. It was a tiny reclaiming of space and time that had been quietly stolen for years. The first few mornings were difficult. His mind protested in subtle ways. Restlessness, minor irritation, a constant urge to reach for the phone, to check messages, to fill the silence. He found himself standing there, coffee in hand, simply noticing the emptiness of those minutes. It was boring, almost unbearably so. And yet, he repeated it, day after day. After a week, he added a second small step. He would write down the first task he wanted to accomplish before opening his laptop. Nothing big, not a project that would change his life, just one action, something achievable in the first hour of the day. Sometimes it was sending an email he had been putting off. Sometimes it was reading a few pages of a book. Sometimes it was a short workout. Progress was slow, almost imperceptible. He didn't suddenly feel more productive. He didn't finish months of unfinished work. He didn't wake up one morning with the sense that he had transformed. Most days, it still felt like small, insignificant victories against a habit that had been years in the making. And yet, he noticed the differences, subtle, almost invisible at first. Tasks were completed more often than they weren't. Projects lingered a little less in drafts. Weekends, once a chaotic blur of scrolling and low-effort entertainment, began to hold small pockets of accomplishment. He would finish a chapter, complete an exercise, send an email. Tiny, almost forgettable acts of progress that gradually added up. He faced resistance often. Boredom crept in, old impulses lingered. It was easier to give in, to open a tab, to scroll for just 5 minutes, which inevitably turned into 30. He caught himself sometimes, the familiar tug of distraction, and reminded himself gently, just 5 minutes, start there. No need to overhaul everything at once. Over months, the impact became clearer. Not dramatic, not life-altering, but he began to feel more present, more aware of how he spent his time, more capable of noticing the small habits that had quietly shaped his 20s.
He began to reclaim hours that had slipped away without noticing. Some evenings he still found himself on the couch, aimlessly scrolling. Old habits die slowly. He didn't expect perfection, he didn't expect a sudden transformation, and he didn't chastise himself for slipping. Instead, he observed, acknowledged, and returned to the small practices that slowly built momentum. The change wasn't glamorous. There were no dramatic shifts or grand epiphanies. There was just the quiet accumulation of small, deliberate actions. Minutes stacked into hours, tasks completed, projects finished, a sense of control, subtle and steady, returning in ways that were easy to overlook, but impossible to ignore if he paid attention. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, he reflected on what these small steps meant, not just for work or projects, but for himself, for his confidence, his attention, his sense of purpose. He didn't feel fixed, and he didn't need to. He felt aware. He felt capable of noticing where he went astray and choosing differently, if only in small increments. Some nights the old discomfort returned. He would lie awake, mind restless, remembering all the time lost. But now the reflection didn't feel paralyzing. It was a guide, a reminder that change was possible, even in tiny doses. He could experiment, try one more small habit, and watch it accumulate over weeks and months. He understood finally that progress isn't sudden, that life isn't transformed overnight, that small, repeated actions, chosen with attention, could quietly shape the trajectory of days and weeks and years. And he realized that sometimes the only way forward is to take one tiny step, notice it, repeat it, and trust that the sum of these small actions could eventually outweigh the habits that had silently held him back. There was no conclusion, no triumph, no finish line, only a slow, measured awareness, a quiet persistence, and the faint but growing sense that life could be different if he continued. And in that unresolved, ongoing reflection, there was a fragile sense of hope.